more powerful system was controlled by just one angle of attack sensor. The MCAS system is safety critical. And on an airplane, you never, ever have a safety critical system that has a single point of failure.
The angle of attack sensors protrude out of either side of the fuselage near the cockpit. If a happy birthday Mylar balloon gets stuck on that vane, it becomes unreliable. But believe it or not, we hit balloons, we hit birds, and all of these things are not uncommon.
If that sensor is damaged or faulty, it will send a wrong message to the MCAS system, which then tries to take over the plane from the pilots.
None of this was communicated by anybody at Boeing to the FAA engineer who was in charge of oversight, and yeah, it should have been.
The FAA was kept out of the loop. Usually, it's a constant negotiation between a regulator and the regulated about what parts of the airplane are going to change.
But in the case of Boeing, they had a culture of concealment, deliberate concealment regarding the MCAS system. And the evidence kept mounting.
Coordination sheets are technical documents written to archive information. This cord sheet is capturing the history of MCAS.
This is basically about the safety issues that were analyzed inside Boeing. And the most relevant part of this dealt with how quickly pilots would be able to react if the system went haywire.
I haven't seen this particular cord sheet before. With pilot training to recognize the runaway, a reaction time scenario greater than 10 seconds found the failure to be catastrophic.
So if you don't respond in less than 10 seconds to this situation, you can't recover. 10 seconds, which is ridiculous.
But the problem here is not just the reaction time. The problem here is the term pilot training. It says, with pilot training to recognize the runaway, they're saying that we can't just throw pilots at this without awareness of the system. And which that's the real gotcha, right, in his statement. Pilots need to be trained on MCAS to potentially avoid killing people. And Boeing knew that this was the case. And yet pilot training never happened.
Our reporting and the memos and documents that have been released revealed an underbelly, an underside of the company. In this March 28, 2017 internal Boeing communication, the chief technical pilot for the 737 MAX writes, I want to stress the importance of holding firm that there will not be any type of simulator training required. Boeing will not allow that to happen. We'll go face to face with any regulator who tries to make that a requirement. The tragedy of it is some of these emails were actually conversations with Lion Air. In a June 6, 2017 email exchange, which took place the year before the crash, Lion Air says, in effect, wouldn't it be better, wouldn't it be safer to have some additional training? We want more than you're recommending. And Boeing writes flat out, there is absolutely no reason to require a MAX simulator to begin flying the MAX.
If they had said what the true power of MCAS was, simulator training would be required fleet-wide for all 737 MAX pilots. Instead, Boeing literally mocked Lion Air, mocked them for wanting to have simulator training.
Boeing had to, berate them You cannot have simulator training. You can't do it. Costs money. We lose money. They talked about Jedi mind tricking regulators around the world into adopting the standard of no simulator training required.
So we're supposed to react in less than 10 seconds to a system that's never been on any airplane we've ever flown before. Boeing knew pilots had a monster waiting for them in the MCAS system, but they conspire to not offer training. It's just unconscionable to me. It's nuts.
In the end, Boeing succeeded, and when the plane was delivered to airlines, it didn't appear from the outside that there was something fundamentally wrong with the aircraft. I mean, they were making sales all over the world.
Boeing sold over 5,000 Maxes. It's an unbelievable number. It really was the product that brought the financial performance on Wall Street up to a level that Boeing had never seen before.
Boeing's profit soared. The stock value went through the roof. And that was the whole idea. Performance was being judged in quarterly returns. And the MAX delivered.
The 737 MAX was going to be the major meal ticket for Boeing for coming decades.
This is a company that, 500 is a reasonable number.
And it was seen as a sure thing.
Unprecedented value for our customers in terms of saving fuel, in terms of being reliable, in terms of being maintainable. And you know what we've done? We've created an airplane that's going to exceed their expectations by any way you measure it.
Everyone thought that the good times would never end. And then in October of 2018, they did.
The Lion Air pilots not only didn't know how the system worked, they didn't know the name of the system. They didn't even know that the MCAS system was on the aircraft.
You just got the airplane into the air, and all of a sudden, bang, all these bells, warnings, and whistles and stick shaker going off.
An angle attack sensor, which that either failed or was damaged, was sending a bad input to the cockpit. It would have taken more than a few seconds, certainly, for the pilots to determine what the cause was. And then as soon as the flaps were retracted, MCAS was activated.
You started the clock, right? 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi.
The way MCAS kept pushing the nose of the airplane down was maniacal. And the pilots never understood it was trying to kill them.
You've got 10 seconds.
Thank you so much for everyone to coming out tonight and for that film. And to our panelists tonight, it's great to be back in person for these types of events. I'm Liliana Byington, and I'm a reporter for Bloomberg Government. I cover transportation policy. And now all of these faces should be familiar to you from the film, but tonight we have Rory Kennedy, director of the film. We have Captain Dan Carey, who, as you saw, testifying on behalf of pilots. You have Michael Stumo, who tragically lost his daughter in the crash and tirelessly advocated for families, and Congressman Peter DeFazio, who is chairman of the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. Thank you for all of us for being here tonight. We'll start with a little bit of a panel, and then we'll get to your questions as well. Just to start with you, Rory, why did you pick this story to tell for the documentary?
Well, I followed the story and these crashes when they happened, and I fly like so many people. I'm a little scared of flying, honestly, and I was really kind of taken aback when both of these planes crashed within 5 months of each other, the same aircraft, and looking at Boeing's response to those events. You know, my gut was that they would respond by saying, how deeply sorry they were, and take responsibility, ground the planes immediately, do everything they could to fix it, and instead they seemed to really focus on pilot error. I felt like that there was a lot more going on there. I wanted to understand what exactly happened and who knew what when, who was responsible for this, in hopes of making a film that would help contribute to something like this never happening again.
And why did you choose to focus on the Hill and bring the legislative aspect of it into the film?
Well, I really wanted to, the story was still unfolding as we were documenting it, and, my intention was to document the voices who were most directly involved in these events and to really try to understand from the inside out what happened. I'm so grateful to everybody here on this panel and everybody who contributed to this story, because, without their voices, we wouldn't really know what happened. And the film was trying to get to the bottom of that, and so we were really, with the investigation, documenting what happened as the committee was understanding what happened. So as kind of a narrative thread to help the audience also understand. It was important, and then, my interest, as I said, was to try to make a film that contributed to something like this never happening again, and I think that the best way to do that is through legislation and, ensuring that the laws are both created and enforced in a way to ensure safety.
And Congressman DeFazio, when did you mentioned in the film that the investigation began after that second crash? When did you know that it was on your committee's responsibility to get an investigation going and to do a legislative fix? Was there any inclination after that first crash, or was it really the second crash where you kicked it off?
Well, I
think you have to hold it.
Okay. Well, I after the first crash, I summoned the so-called head of safety at the FAA, Ali Barami, and he came to my office and he said, "This was a one-off, never going to happen again. We think it was faulty maintenance. Sensor had just been, replaced." And ultimately, in fact, they did find a company that was rebuilding sensors was disbarred from future work. But then when the second plane went in, I called the acting administrator and I said, "This seems just like the first plane. We had early radar tracks," and they said, "Well, we got to wait for more data. We got to wait for more data." And then finally, we got that data, courtesy of the Canadians with a satellite system, and it was eerily the same. And I had just taken over the committee in January, and so, and we had just hired, the former chair did not have an investigations oversight committee, which is a critical function of Congress, and I had just hired my first staff, and I said, this is it. We are going to investigate this. We're going to get to the bottom of it. This shouldn't have happened, and it went on from there. It was extraordinary. I mean, just the discovery process with Boeing and the struggle to get the documents, and then the documents just came in massive amounts. I mean, the staff, we hired more staff, and they had to pour through them one by one. There's no index. And then we tried to get information out of the FAA, who actually in the end was less forthcoming. And that's why we, in the end, concluded the whole system had to change. They were referring to Boeing as a customer. I said, they're not a customer. They're a regulated entity. You're there to enforce safety. You're not there to promote them. In fact, after the ValueJet crash, and I was junior on the committee, and I had for years been saying you can't regulate and promote, which was left over from the Civil Aviation Administration transition. And they would always say, oh, there's no problem, no problem. After ValueJet, and they had rejected my idea, I had introduced a bill to separate them. They came to me and said, where would we put that in the pending FAA bill? I said, well, you can't do that. It wasn't in the Senate bill, it wasn't in the House bill. In those days, we followed the rules. It's not conferenceable. They said, don't worry about it. And they put it in, but then it crept back.
Right, and one of the mentions in the film is the mention of the TARUM, which was that analysis that was done between those two crashes with the FAA and that conversation between Boeing and the FAA about that. Did you find that, the FAA, what would happen now? Is there more transparency in that process, and kind of, how is that able to happen?
Well, when we found out about the TARUM, I was just absolutely appalled. I mean, you continued to fly a plane when you knew 15 at least were going to go down over the life of the fleet. Their own test pilot couldn't meet 10 seconds. Sully had one hell of a time, knowing it was coming, knowing it existed, meeting the 10 seconds. And these pilots were victims. So we totally reformed the process. There was a lot of resistance at first on my committee. Michael can attest to that from some of the first hearings. And on the Senate side, they were going to do a very minimalistic change. And then after our report came out, everything changed. And suddenly it was, wow, we do need a major overhaul, became bipartisan. And we have totally reformed the way aircraft will be certificated in the future. We're not going to have Boeing choosing its people to oversee the process who are in their chain of command, as designated authorities, and being told, sit down, be quiet, do what they want. We had a captive regulator in the Seattle office. They're probably just spending, we had the head of production. We asked him, did you ever see an FAA inspector on the floor? The guy, the engineer who complained about the speed at which they were putting these planes out and said that this was a real problem and said he wouldn't put his family on a Boeing again or a Max. It was just, the whole thing was, just very shattering for me. And it's, and it was, as the movie says, and as others in the movie said, it was all driven by greed and pressure from Wall Street, which unfortunately is affecting many industries in America.
And Captain Carey, you mentioned there's, a lawmaker asked you in a hearing about the pilots of other countries, and there was this, narrative being pushed about, the training of pilots in other countries and kind of how that compares to U.S. pilots. What was it like to kind of fight that narrative that was being pushed and to speak with pilots at the time?
Well, that always upsets me when I hear people try to claim that the aviation cultures in foreign countries aren't up to par with the aviation culture here in the United States. It's just not true. For example, I was the director of flight for the presidency of the Republic of Equatorial Guinea for 2 years, 2012 and 13. And I put in place the Boeing fleet for the Republic of Equatorial Guinea in West Africa. So where did we train our pilots and where did we do our heavy maintenance? On the Boeing 777, the Boeing 767, and the presidential Boeing 737. We did our maintenance and training at Ethiopian Airlines in Addis Ababa. Those of you who are not familiar with Ethiopian Airlines, it was started in 1945 by Trans World Airlines under Howard Hughes with a contract with Emperor Selassie. It was managed and regulated by TWA until 1980. They were the first airline in Africa to have Boeing overhaul license with the European Aviation Safety Authority and the FAA in the 1960s. And their training facility, American Airlines maintains the largest jet pilot training facility in the world. I can tell you right now, the training facility at Addis Ababa is second to nobody's. In fact, at the time, Ethiopian Airlines was the only airline in the world that had a active and functional 737 MAX simulator. So let's put that boogeyman back in the closet once and for all.
And Michael, I of course want to get to you. You know, you mentioned in the film how hard it is to kind of have to retell that story, you know, about your daughter and about what happened. When did you decide that, you know, turning to the Hill and advocating lawmakers was the way to do it, and how did you kind of organize that with other victims' families?
Soon after the crash, the victims' families, you know, nowadays we have WhatsApp, we have things that they didn't have in the 90s, and they were all reaching out to each other and connecting. But when we started, we found at the end of April, we learned that the FAA's Flight Standards Board was going to issue a rule requiring an hour of computer training to get back in the MAX. And we thought, whoa, the fix is in. We got to get up off the floor. We contacted about 30 families who signed a letter saying, shouldn't do this. I mean, and actually the comment period is usually 30 days, and they'd made it 15. There's people in the FAA today that did that stuff, okay? And I went in there just before it expired and went in and talked. I tried to get to DOT, the deputy, to Chow, but I got the deputy chief of staff, and I said, you know, what are you doing? We want an extension of time as families, and here's a letter. If we got to file something formally, let me know, but here's a letter informally, extend it. And they did, and then T&I committee started holding hearings, and my wife was very active, contacting families, getting their pictures, very focused on getting the pictures, which had, as you can see in the film, having the pictures was a huge impact, and getting permission, and and her brother in California was putting the palette of pictures, and we had to go to a print shop here in Washington and get the pictures and come to the hearing, and everybody distribute them and run Airbnbs for everyone and get them there. But it was important because congressmen come into the hearing, they're busy, they've got this, they got that, and here's another hearing. And we sit there with our pictures, and they start looking, and they keep looking, and they look, and they see the humans that were and that aren't. And you could see their professional faces sort of melt into more human faces. And we did that in every office relentlessly. And I can't even talk today hardly without, the emotion creeps back out, and sometimes I choke up. Maybe one day that goes away, but that's just the way life is. But it's not just me, it's those families that were all there. They traveled from Poland, they traveled from Canada, they traveled from Africa to come to these hearings until COVID put a stop to it. So there's, all the things that came together for Captain Carey to record that conversation when he did, changed the narrative at that point. For Chairman DeFazio to be in place with his oversight committee in place when he did was important. But still, the aviation safety legislation is generational. It's hugely important. It's still got to be implemented right at the FAA, and there are still those people. We just found out last week that somebody who was overseeing Boeing's safety in a problematic way for Boeing was going to be moved out, and we had to all come together and, you know, try to put a stop to it. We've got a new administrator that's going to be coming up, and I mean, this is a 44,000 person agency, and there's a lot of people that have been there for 10 years in positions that are still trying to not, for the aviation safety legislation, they want to change just enough to remain the same. So any new administrator has to be a real dedicated change agent to come in there and start unwinding and unwind 15 years of delegating safety to Boeing, which is basically catch and kill. Boeing can catch the safety system and kill it, as well as the other manufacturers. And there has to be a strong person doing that, because they have a lot of pushback.
Yeah, and at the end of the film, there's, you know, mention of the legislation passing as well as the fine to Boeing. Do you think, this kind of question to all of you, do you think that there has been enough done to prevent something like this to happen again, kind of to all of you, or do you think that there's more that still needs to occur?
Those guys at the top never faced anything personal. Right now, in the civil litigation, we're trying to bring them in personally, Calhoun and Muhlenberg, and they're fighting it. With the deferred prosecution agreement, the criminal settlement, which we are also challenging. Rory, you need to make 4 more films here, because there's about the aviation safety legislations, there's about the implementation, there's about the corrupt and crooked criminal settlement that let them off the hook. I mean, this has to be season 1. My wife is
just getting started.
Yeah, my wife is in Illinois trying to change Illinois law, because under Illinois law, where Boeing is headquartered, if you recklessly and criminally injure someone, you can be liable for punitive damages, which is not covered by insurance. But if you go further and kill them, you don't pay punitive damages. And so she's trying to change that, living in a Motel 6 and swimming in the YMCA in the morning because her back is bad, and then going to the legislature to harangue legislators. But those guys, Muhlenberg and Calhoun, if you read the August of last year Delaware Chancery Court decision on what they did after the first crash and how they said, we've met, we've had safety, we've done, you know, they're putting it all out. They didn't even have a safety committee on the board. And the Chancery Court said for a fundamental safety corporation like Boeing they're liable to their shareholders for not having a safety committee on the board. And that they said they had examined it and said it's safe, and everything they said in November and December to the public was false. And their shareholder liability. I mean, that court opinion it implicates Calhoun, it implicates Muhlenberg, but the Department of Justice didn't. They said in their criminal settlement affirmatively that Boeing executives didn't do anything wrong, which is weird. It's never happened. You either find they did something wrong or you say nothing. So we're challenging that in a Crime Victims' Rights Act case right now in the Fort Worth, Texas division of Texas with a former Republican judge who's the best on this and doing it pro bono. I mean, there's so many fronts going on to this Boeing thing. I mean,
well, you know, what's criminal is, you know, the test pilot was a really bad guy. But he isn't the guy who came up with the idea that we're going to rush this plane out the door and no simulator training will be required. That started at the very top with a conversation with one airline who said, we're going to buy all Airbus unless you can match it. That's when they scratched the new design. That's when they decided, and their first sales brochure, before they had even designed the new plane, said no simulator training required. And one major airline was also told, if you have to use simulator training, we'll pay you $1 million per plane. So imagine the pressure from the corporate executive offices, from the boardroom. I don't know what they do for $350,000 a year, but the guy who was chair of the board during all of this, he's now the head of Boeing. Is he going to be transformative? Is he going to take them back to what they were, the greatest engineering aerospace company in the world? I fear not, unless there are more consequences.
I would add, that 346 people died and nobody's at the top has gone to prison, right? If somebody up here killed one person, they would likely spend the rest of their life in prison. So it's stunning to me that nobody has served any time. Just this past week, there was 2 reports. One that said that Boeing is in all likelihood going to lobby to circumnavigate having to have for the 737 MAX 10 that's coming to market, they're going to try to circumnavigate the requirement to have modern, you can describe it better, but it's a modern system that will alert pilots if there's any kind of serious situation.
Yeah, the system Rory's speaking of is the Boeing 737 MAX received an exemption from the FAA to not have electronic cockpit monitoring system. It's the only airliner in the world that does not have this system. It's a modern, intuitive system that's been around for 20 years that when there's a problem in the cockpit, it actually tells the flight crew exactly what the problem is. So unlike the video you saw where the crew is faced with multiple compound failures, they don't know which one to address first. That is eliminated through the electronic, the ICAS, or the electronic cockpit monitoring system. And as Rory described, the MAX 10 is up for certification this year. Now, the law giving the exemption, I believe, Congressman, expires at the end of this year. And Boeing may be seeking an exemption because they may not be able to get the MAX 10 up to certification standards by the end of the year. So I hope that the government learns their lesson and does not give them another exemption.
And, I would say at the same time, the Boeing executives, despite a loss of billions and billions of dollars in this past year, the top 7 executives got bonuses of $57 million. So, there continues to be, I think, a narrative that suggests that they haven't really learned the lesson of these tragedies.
I want to double down on that MAX 10 exemption again. I mean, since 2009, they were supposed to have flight deck systems that don't create nuisance and false alerts, which we saw in the film. And we had to, because there's some families now, several that are monitoring this and working with folks that are experts. And we sent in a letter, here we go again, it's us again. We sent in a letter to everybody on the aviation committees, everybody at FAA, everybody at DOT, saying, look, it doesn't even comply with current rules. We've got 4 crashes, Aero Peru and Bergen Air, and then these 2 crashes that were implicated in part by pilots being confused and overworked by nuisance alerts. And now we found with the MAX, there's a database, the NASA database, with pilots report to about problems with planes. We found 10 problems last year with confusing nuisance and false alerts in the new MAXes. U.S. pilots, U.S. training, U.S. maintenance, the new MAXes. And for them to even think of not modernizing it with 4 crashes, these most recent 2, and they're going back to their old games, I mean, it's just ridiculous, and FAA better not allow it.
There is so much to talk about on this, but I want to make sure we get to the audience's questions. So if you have a question, please come up to one of the microphones, and we'll be able to get you to ask any of the panelists.
Yes, I think, is that working? I think that
your mouth really close. Take it off.
This is, of course, Michael Goldfarb, who was in the film.
Whoever the new FAA administrator, whoever's nominated or goes through the process of meeting courtesy calls with the Senate and the House should have to watch the film. And there should be a series of questions after the film, because we have a right to know how they would react, where they stand along the continuum. Rory, your second film needs to be Downfall, the case against FAA. FAA enabled this, not just a Tarim report. Today, at the 787 plant in Charleston, every single Dreamliner is being inspected by the government. So that means our taxpayer dollars are propping up Boeing's aircraft. That's unheard of. They should either be in receivership, or the government should have a broader rule. There's FAA once again working side by side with Boeing to get that airplane in the air. And the question's whether it should be. And then finally, we were part of a group that tried to get FAA and Boeing to allow us to look at the technical criteria for the reconstitution of the MAX. What was going to change? Sully was in this, technical people, much smarter than I am. We couldn't get in the door. Everything was FOIA'd. Everything was blacked out. We got no information. So the question is, why do we think today that that plane's flying? Why do we trust the people who did the original analysis, whether FAA or Boeing, to come together again and do the new analysis? So I think there's a lot of issues. You know, I think, Congressman, your legislation, you know, you may have to stay around because, you know, multiple legislation is needed. And we haven't gotten to the cultural part of this that I think we ought to. That was I have no question for you, Laura.
Thank you.
Well, we did appoint a technical outside committee, which was not overseen by FAA. And my understanding, and I'm not a pilot and I'm not that technical, is basically they went back to the original system, which is one deflection, and that's it. And the pilots, you know, the thing I always liked about Boeing was that I would say, you know, we believe in the pilots flying the airplane. I mean, Airbus went to, you know, they had some problems early on with go-rounds and other things with software glitch. So they couldn't, there's so much software in these damn things, you don't know where the problem is. You know, but here we always had the, you know, and the captain can speak more of this, the pilot is always going to be able to fly the plane.
And I'd just like to, Michael didn't ask a question, but you did make a pertinent statement. And Dennis Taser, Captain Taser, was in the meeting with Boeing at Allied Pilots headquarters in November of 2018, shortly after the Lion Air accident. And we were so distressed by Boeing's response to our questions, you saw some of it on the tape, that the minute we walked out of that meeting, we summoned our general counsel, and we wrote FOIA requests that day to the FAA, the DOT, Secretary of Transportation, and FedExed them, US mailed them, and emailed them for all technical and certification data on the MCAS system. The minute Boeing left our office, and to this day, we have not received a response.
As I said earlier, and this is, you know, we're still getting documents from FAA that we asked for before, and they say, oh, the computers, or they can't really find this, or they can't track it. I always wanted Ali Barami's email chain when he told us he was not aware of the TARIM. The head of safety, someone didn't run to his office and stick that in his face and say, look at this, but he said, no, and we interviewed him for 7 hours, clueless. So what does the head of safety do? I brought that up numerous times with the outgoing administrator and the acting administrator.
Thank you. Given the 5,000 deliveries of 737 MAX that Boeing was able to provide in the soaring stocks and the bonuses, was there any documents that showed that Boeing had cost out how much it would have cost them to put pilots back in simulators, or has that been estimated at all?
Well, I don't know about the costs per, I mean, you know, as you heard, a couple of days paid, not flying a plane, but in simulator training, there has been, and probably still is, a shortage of MAX simulators. So there'd be a very long line, which means a lot of pilots would be waiting a very long time before they could fly the MAX. You know, and then there was a guarantee, which was with one airline, that they'd pay them $1 million per plane if they had to have simulators. You know, I'm not aware, we never found that they had made that guarantee to anybody else, but it was certainly, you know, kind of implied in their literature and all that. Rory, did you want?
No, I think it was Southwest Airlines that they had that.
Right.
And just to answer that on a pilot per hour training perspective, at American Airlines, we have nearly 5,000 737 pilots, and it would cost about $10,000 a piece to put them through the additional training. So it's a very significant cost, but money well spent.
And they would be backed up waiting to get certified, I mean, for a very long time.
I just want to express my awe and admiration for all of you sitting up there in terms of what you've done to expose the problem and look for solutions. I had the bittersweet privilege, I guess, of meeting Samya a month and a half before this tragic crash, and so I followed very closely the whole investigation. But what you put together, Rory, it just really is heart-stopping, really. So I followed a lot of it, but the one thing that I somehow missed is how did a chief executive who didn't go to prison get a $60 million reward in leaving the company? I mean, that's just incomprehensible to me. You know, just walk away with $60 million. It's incomprehensible. The other thing that I wonder, I really have a lot of questions, but I did wonder if there was an Inspector General report about the crash and what it may have revealed.
Well, you know, it's hard. Kathy, did we get an IG report on this? Do you remember? It's hard to remember some of the history. I mean, I think we asked. I assume it. Okay. We have a staff
Not that
here.
revealing, I guess.
I have to refer to
Not
them as my
memorable.
portable memory units. I have to try and remember a lot of things and be an expert in more things than I can be an expert. But yes, why don't you?
Yeah, so the Inspector General has been doing a review. They've released 2 reports. One was a timeline of incidents at FAA and at Boeing. They did a second review of FAA certification process and found a number of flaws, and they're working on a third part of that report that will look at FAA's return to service and of the 737 MAX.
I just want to thank you. I know you really can't answer the $60 million question.
I'm just going to add that there's one place that has not been sufficiently inspected is the production line. These plants were run with too many planes going through, with after they'd squeezed out a lot of employees, they'd squeezed their suppliers, and as Ed Pearson, who's here tonight, said, there's no evidence of any bird strikes in those AOA sensors. He suspects it was at the factory when they failed to validate parts, failed to make sure they're any good. They're putting planes together in out of order, and so that's it's one thing, as Elon Musk said, doing a prototype is easy. Manufacturing at scale is 1,000 times harder, and getting all those planes to conform to what they say they're going to do with on the cheap is something I know Chairman DeFazio is investigating at the 787 plant, but there's metrics like plant health metrics, like how far behind schedule are you, deliveries behind schedule, this and that, and that's just another, it's another movie.
And I'd just like to add another thing. The Boeing Aircraft Company is still lying to each and every one of us. We saw up there Chairman Calhoun say that the Boeing 737 MAX is as safe as any airplane in the sky. And I can tell you, it's not. It's not my opinion. It's a technical fact. The reason it needed a crutch like an MCAS system was because it was aerodynamically unstable in its wind tunnel tests. And furthermore, it lacks, as Rory explained earlier, it lacks the electronic cockpit monitoring system that every other airplane in the sky has. And other airplanes have triple redundancy through their computer flight control and fly-by-wire systems. And this airplane only has 2 redundancies. So it's not as safe as anything out there. In fact, it's the least safe airplane in the sky. I'm not saying it's unsafe, but it's the least safe.
You know, and Boeing has had trouble getting the tankers accepted by the Air Force with quality issues, but the Air Force required three sensors. They required 3. Boeing was already doing that on a modern plane, but it's inexplicable, as I said in the movie, a single point of failure to a safety critical system. And Elwell at the first hearing, I got him to admit that this was a safety critical system, as I recall. And so.
And it's, you know, it's not legal to have just a one backup or not have a backup system. And when Boeing was asked, well, you can't do this. You have to have a backup system. Boeing said, well, the backup is the pilots. Well, the pilots didn't know the system was on the airplane, so.
Hi. First off, I'd like to start by beginning to thank all of you on the impact you're affecting on millions of lives in a global industry, and sorry for your loss. And thank you and the rest of the families for your continuous advocacy on this issue and fighting to change a truly corrupt system. My question is, one thing I found interesting in the film is it took action outside of the FAA from international regulatory bodies, whether that be China, Australia, and other countries, grounding the 737 MAX. So kind of what has been the process, if any, in engaging with global partners on this issue, since the airline industry is one that is international, and especially considering global supply chains when manufacturing aircraft and the global aspects of the flight industry and having it be a global system. Could any of you touch on that? And thank you again.
Well, the plane, there was an international agreement that the plane wouldn't go in the air until they had approval from the Europeans and other agencies. And that did happen, but as you hear, I mean, there's still some real concerns here. I mean, again, if you think of the cacophony that was going on inside that, that flight deck or on the flight deck, and nothing prioritizing what the problem was, and we're going to now have another generation of MAX, the 10. I didn't know that they hadn't moved forward, that they were trying to get an exemption, and I won't be following up on that.
Thank you.
Fantastic work, and second everybody's emotion. Thank you so much for sharing your story and going through all that pain again, and just all your dedication. I don't understand why there aren't criminal charges. There's a paper trail, and a human is not a backup system. And I'm just confused. I mean, you look at the opioid crisis and the Sacklers, and it's driven by Wall Street and greed, and if this is, it seems like criminal charges are kind of easy, maybe, to prove. I don't know.
Well, Michael's, they're trying to reopen the agreement, under victims' rights, which were ignored, and other issues. And no, I agree with you. There should have been people other than the test pilot being prosecuted. Again, he was a bad guy, but he didn't come up with this idea. He didn't create the rush. He didn't guarantee. He wasn't the one who gave the guarantee there'd be no simulator training. And in fact, he failed to be able to fly the airplane, even knowing it was happening, which certainly would show that there was an extreme problem. We asked the FAA, given our report and given one of the things Rory highlighted, which was that meeting in 2013 where they said no one outside Boeing can know about this, call it speed trim, asked the FAA to reopen that and look at who at the FAA was involved in that, and they denied our request.
I'll say on the criminal side, so Boeing, the investigation against the Boeing for lying to the FAA started between the crashes when someone told FBI that that Boeing had lied to the FAA. So they started that investigation. It didn't become sort of open secret for a while, but by summer, so that was in 2018, the first crash, March 10th, 2019, ours, but the investigation was started, the one in Ethiopia. In the summer, it became kind of an open secret. All the investigations were happening with Chairman DeFazio, several from the agency. In February 2020, then almost a year after the crash, we asked DOJ, said, hey, we're crime victims here. Any of that you're doing with Boeing, you need to talk to us because there's a Crime Victims' Rights Act that says you have to meet and confer with crime victims before you don't just sort of stiff-arm them and ignore them when you are engaging in investigation and prosecution decisions. You have to meet and confer. Because they try to do that over the years, so Congress actually had to pass a law in the 2000s, which was passed unanimously. It's not a partisan issue, crime victims' rights. They told us there's no investigation. We wrote back and said, well, everyone says there are. Please check again. Nope, nothing. So then, in November, the election happens. There's a big brouhaha about who won. Barr resigns, Attorney General Barr resigns in December 2020. The Capitol Hill riots, insurrection, whatever you call it, is on January 6th. On January 7th, the Department of Justice files criminal information in Fort Worth, Texas. What is that? Did you see anything about Fort Worth, Texas in the film? There's nothing about Fort Worth, Texas. What's unique about Fort Worth is it does have an American Airlines office in it, so they're allegedly a party harmed or a victim. And that is one of the few courts where when you file something, you know exactly which judge you're going to get. Others, you have a rotation, maybe 3 judges, and you don't know who you're going to get. This one, you're going to get. It's Judge Reed O'Connor. So it sounds like they wanted to choose him. We'll see. He's going to hear our case now and challenging it. So they filed the criminal information. They filed an agreement saying, it was bad behavior. It was the 2 pilots. The executives are fine. They didn't do anything wrong. And, we were surprised. Kirkland and Ellis is Boeing's criminal defense attorneys. They have a revolving door with justice. So we think, it's probably whisper, whisper, and they kind of arranged it before there's a change in administration. We did go to Merrick Garland and say, hey, you can change this now. We've challenged this. We're challenging it now. And Merrick Garland, you were a crime victims' rights advocate before. You can change this. We're clearly within the scope. But unfortunately, they filed and they're fighting us on it, saying we are not victims protected by the act. So now we have to fight them.
There is certainly a lot more to say on this. I think we're almost out of time. Do we maybe have time for one more question?
Yes, hi. My name is Ed Pearson. I just wanted to thank all of you for the wonderful work that you have done. And I did have a couple things I wanted to share that are, I think, timely. It pains me as a retired Boeing employee to say that our company really screwed up, and I think we're still screwing up. It's not the employees, it's the leadership. But I want to also say there's 2 things, Captain Carey, I really appreciate your leadership on this, and Captain Tager, really appreciate it. Your comment about the airplane being safe, I would love to say that the airplane is safe, and I'll tell you, I just finished a report. Just in the last year, there's been 42 in-flight malfunctions of the 737 MAX since it was ungrounded. This is not and half of those incidents involve the flight control system. These are data coming from 2 government databases, the NASA Anonymous database and also the FAA's own data. On 6 of those flights, United States pilots declared emergencies. If you read those write-ups, I think you're going to see that there's a lot of information that's scarily similar to the crashes. Indicated airspeed, altitude, master caution, stab trim, all that kind of stuff. So I just want to make a point of that people don't know this. Secondly, this summer, I want to back up. I actually wrote a report on the accident investigations, and I showed that both airplanes had electrical anomalies, unexplained electrical defects in both airplanes in the weeks before they crashed. This summer, I was talking with a colleague of mine that worked with me in the factory, and he told me something that I had not heard, and that was that immediately after the first crash, factory executives tasked employees to go retrieve the production records, to put a PowerPoint together, and forward it up the chain. This employee assumed that this information was coming up the chain to Chicago and then off to the other appropriate authorities. And I asked him, I said, do you remember what those reports said? And he said to me that the report said that both airplanes, he did this for both planes after both crashes, firsthand, that they both had electrical problems and avionic systems problems on the planes, inside the factory and even after it rolled out. This information has never come out. I know there's been an appropriate amount of focus on MCAS because it is definitely a root cause, but I just want to point out that this information never saw the light of day. And to me, that's criminal. So I know I went to the Department of Justice, couldn't get anybody to answer the phone, tried to write to Attorney General Merrick Garland, talked to the FBI this summer. I shared this information with the FBI this summer. FBI said they were going to look into it. They were going to talk to other agencies. I gave them the names of 2 cooperating witnesses who were willing to talk to them, and the FBI has done nothing. They've not talked to these individuals, and they've not returned any of my phone calls. And I just want you to know that's our lead, law enforcement, Department of Justice and FBI. And as a son of a Washington, D.C. homicide detective, I learned a long time ago that you're supposed to follow the evidence and not just stop looking. So I wanted to share that information with you.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, to our panelists tonight and for all of you for coming out to watch.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.